Imagine stepping into a war thousands of miles away, in a land you barely understand, driven not by self-defense but by fear. Fear of an idea, of a theory, of what might happen if you do not act. That was America's entry into the Vietnam War. It was not a reaction to an invasion or an attack on U.S. soil. It was a calculated decision, built on Cold War anxieties, historical arrogance, and a deep misreading of a nation fighting for its own identity. Vietnam at the time was not merely a battlefield. It was the epicenter of a century-long struggle against foreign domination. First the Chinese, then the French, then the Japanese, and once more the French. By the time American boots landed, the Vietnamese had already been fighting for generations for sovereignty, not ideology. But to U.S. policymakers, it was not that simple. In their eyes, Vietnam was a pawn in a much larger game. If one domino fell to communism, they feared, the rest of Southeast Asia would tumble with it. And so, the United States walked into a hornet's nest of colonial resentment, civil conflict, and nationalist revolution, armed with napalm and good intentions, but woefully unprepared for the reality on the ground. What followed was a war that would take the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers and more than 2 million Vietnamese. A war that would divide the American public, destroy political careers, and leave scars emotional, environmental, and historical that still have not fully healed. It would lead to the first televised war protests, the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, and the ultimate question that still haunts us today: was it worth it? In today's video, we are going beyond the headlines, the textbooks, and the government speeches. We are diving deep into what really happened in Vietnam, and more importantly, why it happened. We will explore how strategic miscalculations, misinformation, and political vanity brought the most powerful military in the world into a war it could not win, in a country it never truly understood. But before we get into it, if you are passionate about uncovering history's hidden layers, if you are tired of oversimplified narratives, and if you believe in learning from the past so we do not repeat it, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. It helps the channel grow and brings these deeper stories to more curious minds like yours. This is not just a history lesson. It is a mirror, so take a breath, get comfortable, and prepare to revisit one of the most controversial chapters in modern history from a perspective that challenges everything you thought you knew. When the Second World War came to a close, the world stood at a crossroads. The old empires were crumbling, their hold over colonies loosening in the wake of global devastation and shifting moral tides. The United States emerged not just as a victor of war, but as a self-proclaimed champion of freedom and democracy. With President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter setting a tone for a post-colonial world, many believed America would lead the charge in dismantling imperial systems and giving voice to the nations that had long been silenced. But beneath the lofty ideals, the machinery of realpolitik was already grinding into motion. In Southeast Asia, the struggle for freedom was not a theory, it was life and death. Vietnam, long a colony under French rule, had endured generations of exploitation. Then came the Japanese occupation during World War II, which shattered what little stability remained. But in the chaos, a movement took root led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, who combined nationalism with Marxist ideals to fight for Vietnamese independence. They resisted Japan, and after Japan's surrender in 1945, they declared Vietnam a free republic. For a brief moment, it seemed the global wave of decolonization had reached Indochina. But the moment did not last. France, reeling from its own wartime trauma, was desperate to reclaim its colonial possessions. And to the surprise of many, and the betrayal felt by even more, the United States supported them despite its rhetorical commitment to self-determination. The U.S. began channeling financial and logistical support to the French war effort in Vietnam. It was not a quiet contribution. By the early 1950s, the U.S. was funding up to 80% of France's military campaign against the Viet Minh. Why? The answer was not morality, nor loyalty to old allies. It was fear. The Cold War had already gripped Washington, and in the minds of its strategists, Vietnam was not a small nation seeking independence. It was a square on the global chessboard, dangerously close to falling into the hands of communism. China had gone red in 1949. North Korea had launched an invasion across the 38th parallel. and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union loomed large. To U.S. policymakers, Ho Chi Minh was no longer simply a nationalist leader with Leninist ideals. He was another puppet of Moscow, another threat in the domino chain. And so, in a stunning contradiction of its own principles, America backed France's efforts to crush a movement for independence. It was a move that, in retrospect, poisoned everything that followed. Because to the Vietnamese people, especially those in the north, this was not just a colonial war. It was a war against their right to exist on their own terms. When France was eventually defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, it was not just a military loss. It was a symbolic collapse of Western arrogance. But for the U.S., it only hardened their resolve. The Geneva Accords that followed split Vietnam along the 17th parallel, temporarily dividing the nation into North and South. The plan called for democratic elections in 2 years to allow the Vietnamese to decide their future. But fearing a communist victory, the U.S. and its South Vietnamese allies ensured those elections never happened. Once again, the people's voice was silenced, this time not by French imperialists, but by Cold War architects in Washington. Here's where the contradiction deepens. How could the United States, a country born from revolution and resistance to imperial rule, become the very force it once stood against? This was not just policy, it was identity in crisis. In classrooms and speeches, Americans celebrated 1776 as the year they cast off tyranny, yet, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, their government was funding the very tyranny it claimed to despise. The damage of this hypocrisy cannot be overstated. It sowed distrust not only among the Vietnamese, but among young Americans, asked to fight and die in a war with no coherent moral foundation. Soldiers were told they were defending freedom, yet partnered with regimes that jailed dissidents, banned political opposition, and conducted public executions. They were told they were halting communism, but were forbidden from attacking the North directly or dismantling the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The rules of engagement were as confusing as the reasons for being there. And back home, people began to ask questions. Civil rights leaders, students, veterans, they all wanted to know, if this war was so righteous, why did it begin with a lie? Why did it require censorship, secrecy, and distortion to be sustained? Why did it contradict everything America said it stood for? In time, those questions would grow louder. The Pentagon Papers would confirm the deception. The protests would swell. Trust in government would collapse. But long before that tipping point, the contradiction was already baked in. The moment the U.S. chose to bankroll the French war in Vietnam, it set itself on a collision course not just with Southeast Asia, but with its own ideals. Because what happened in Vietnam was not just a war, it was a reckoning. A reckoning with the limits of power, the dangers of ideology, and the cost of abandoning principle for political gain. And it all started when a nation that promised to champion freedom made a quiet deal with empire. A deal that would unravel everything. The fall of French colonial power in Vietnam should have marked a new beginning, a chance for the Vietnamese people to finally claim their destiny. After nearly a century under foreign domination, the defeat of France at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 was a thunderous statement that colonialism, at least in its traditional form, had reached its end. The Geneva Accords, hastily drawn in the aftermath, temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North, under Ho Chi Minh, stood on a platform of nationalism wrapped in Marxist ideology, while the South became a geopolitical experiment propped up not by popular will, but by foreign intervention. The division was never meant to be permanent. The Accords called for nationwide elections in 1956, allowing the Vietnamese to choose their future. But those elections never came. The United States, convinced that a free vote would almost certainly deliver victory to Ho Chi Minh, decided to prevent them. In its place, Washington backed a leader they believed they could control, Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist educated in the West, and seemingly aligned with American values. But beneath the surface, the reality was far more complicated and far more tragic. From the moment Diem took power in the newly created Republic of Vietnam, it was clear he would rule not as a Democrat, but as an authoritarian. He built a regime anchored in loyalty to his family and a narrow base of Catholic elites, alienating the Buddhist majority and silencing critics with ruthless efficiency. Political parties were outlawed, Opposition newspapers were shut down, and dissenters were imprisoned, or worse. Diem did not just target communists. He crushed anyone who questioned his authority, branding them all as threats to national security. Entire villages were uprooted under his strategic Hamlet program, which sought to isolate the population from insurgents, but instead fueled resentment. Monks burned themselves in protest. Students vanished after demonstrations. The streets of Saigon echoed with both fear and frustration. Yet, despite these actions, the U.S. remained steadfast in its support. Billions of dollars in aid flowed into South Vietnam, along with military advisors and diplomatic backing. American officials praised Diem's strength, hailing him as a miracle man of Asia, even as their private memos revealed mounting concern over his repression. Washington saw Diem as a bulwark against communism, a dependable gatekeeper in the escalating Cold War, but in reality he was eroding the very foundation of legitimacy that South Vietnam needed to survive. By clinging to power through intimidation rather than inspiration, Diem alienated the very people he claimed to protect. This contradiction, supporting a repressive regime in the name of freedom, lay at the heart of America's growing entanglement in Vietnam. It was not just a strategic miscalculation, it was a moral dissonance that grew more difficult to justify with each passing year. The United States had presented itself as the guardian of democracy, the heir to the revolutionary spirit of 1776. But in South Vietnam, it had become the patron of an increasingly authoritarian government, one that more closely resembled the colonial regimes of the past than any modern republic. And as Diem tightened his grip, the insurgency in the South grew stronger. The National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, gained support not because of ideology alone, but because they promised an alternative to Diem's corruption and brutality. Villagers who might have stayed neutral began to sympathize with the rebels, not out of love for communism, but out of hatred for the regime that bulldozed their homes and silenced their voices. The very tactics meant to crush dissent only inflamed it further. Inside the White House, doubts began to surface. Some advisors urged caution, warning that Diem was undermining the entire mission. Others believed that removing him was the only way forward. In 1963, amid a wave of Buddhist protests and escalating chaos, the United States gave tacit approval to a military coup. Diem was arrested and assassinated, ending his reign, but not the pattern he had set in motion. His fall did not bring democracy or peace. It led to a carousel of generals, each more unstable than the last. South Vietnam slid further into dysfunction, and American involvement deepened. What began as a policy of containment became an ever-widening war with no clear objective. U.S. troops were told they were defending freedom, yet found themselves allied with regimes that banned elections, suppressed religions, and ruled by decree. They walked through villages whose residents feared both the Viet Cong and the government supposedly sent to protect them. Trust was elusive, loyalty fragile, and the mission increasingly unclear. The Hearts and Minds campaign was doomed from the start, not because the people could not be won over, but because the promises were empty. And the contradictions, too, glaring. Back in the United States, the cracks began to show. As television brought images of the war into living rooms, Americans started asking hard questions. Why were their sons fighting for a government that silenced its own people? Why was the United States, the land of liberty, supporting regimes that rejected every tenet of democratic governance? Why had the fight for freedom turned into a defense of tyranny? The answer was never simple. It lay in a tangled web of ideology, fear, ambition, and misunderstanding. But at its core was a decision made long before the first American combat troops arrived, a decision to choose stability over principle, to fight communism at any cost, even if that meant betraying the very values America claimed to uphold. And so, the story of U.S. involvement in Vietnam became not just a war on foreign soil, but a reckoning with America's identity. A nation that prided itself on being the voice of the voiceless had, in Vietnam, become an enabler of silence. A beacon of democracy had become a shadow behind a curtain of repression. It was a lesson written in fire and anguish, not only for Vietnam, but for all who believed that ideals could survive the weight of geopolitics. It is one of the most consequential turning points in modern American history, yet it remains cloaked in uncertainty and mistrust a moment when the gears of war shifted irreversibly, not due to a grand battle or a catastrophic attack, but because of a murky encounter in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. To the American public at the time, the story was simple and urgent. North Vietnamese patrol boats had launched unprovoked attacks on U.S. Navy vessels operating in international waters. The president called it an act of aggression. Congress responded with near unanimous support for retaliation. Within days, America was at war fully, officially, and with the force of history behind it. But what if the incident that led to this war, a war that would claim millions of lives, never happened the way it was told? Let us rewind. The date was August 2nd, 1964. The USS Maddox, a destroyer in the U.S. 7th Fleet, was operating off the coast of North Vietnam, conducting intelligence-gathering missions as part of covert operations. These missions were tied to Operation 34A, a series of South Vietnamese sabotage raids against the North raids that were coordinated with and supported by the United States. In other words, while the U.S. was not officially at war, it was already deeply involved in shadow operations that blurred the line between observation and provocation. On that day, the Maddox reported being approached and fired upon by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The destroyer returned fire, aided by aircraft from a nearby carrier, and the skirmish ended without American casualties. This engagement, though real, occurred in contested waters and within the broader context of U.S.-backed attacks on North Vietnam's coastline. But what happened or did not happen 2 days later is what changed everything. On August 4th, the Maddox, now joined by the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack in the dark of night. Sonar blips, radar echoes. The sounds of torpedoes, though none hit their targets. The crew, tense and on high alert, fired into the blackness, unsure of what they were targeting. The report sent to Washington described an aggressive North Vietnamese assault. The truth, as later documents and eyewitness accounts would reveal, was far more uncertain. There were no confirmed enemy boats. Many of the attacks were likely phantom signals caused by bad weather and nervous imaginations. The captain of the Maddox himself, in a later message, expressed serious doubts that any attack had occurred. Despite this, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the nation that night, speaking gravely of a second, unprovoked assault on American forces. He asked for and quickly received authorization from Congress to take all necessary measures to protect U.S. interests in Southeast Asia. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed with overwhelming bipartisan support and became the legal foundation for full-scale American military involvement in Vietnam. The impact was immediate and staggering. Within months, American troops began pouring into South Vietnam. Bombing campaigns escalated. The war became real, visible, and irreversible. Yet back in Washington, many in the intelligence and military community already knew that the August 4th attack had never been definitively verified. Some even suspected it had not happened at all. But by the time these doubts surfaced, the machinery of war was already in motion. It was only years later, through the release of the Pentagon Papers and congressional investigations, that the public began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Key officials had withheld doubts, downplayed uncertainty, and presented shaky evidence as certainty. The narrative of unprovoked aggression had served its purpose to justify military escalation. The deeper motivations behind U.S. involvement, containment, credibility, geopolitical image were not discussed publicly. Instead, the American people were told a story of defense, honor, and necessity. And so, the United States entered a war it did not fully comprehend, in a country it could not control, against an enemy it continually underestimated. All sparked by an event that may never have happened. This moment is not just a historical curiosity, it is a warning. It raises difficult but necessary questions. How do governments construct the narratives that justify war? What happens when fear overrides truth? And what is the cost, human, moral, and strategic, of acting on misinformation? In the case of Vietnam, the cost was staggering. By the time the war ended, over 58,000 American soldiers were dead. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and fighters had lost their lives. The landscape was scorched, the region destabilized, and the U.S. public trust in its leaders deeply fractured. The Gulf of Tonkin incident reminds us that history is not just shaped by what happens, but by what is believed to have happened, by the stories that are told, and by the motivations behind those who tell them. So as we move forward in this series, keep that thought close. The truth is often the first casualty of war, and once it is lost, the consequences can last for generations. In the tense atmosphere of the early Cold War, fear was not just an emotion, it was a political weapon, a lens through which every international event was interpreted. To many in Washington, the world seemed divided into two stark camps, the free and the enslaved, democracy and dictatorship, the West and the communist bloc. It was through this binary lens that U.S. leaders looked at Vietnam not as a unique country with its own complex history, culture, and political struggles, but as the next domino in a terrifying chain of global collapse. The story that emerged from this perspective was not shaped by the nuances of Vietnam itself, but by the anxieties of a superpower desperate to maintain its global image. And that story would pave the road to one of the most devastating conflicts in modern history. To the American public, Vietnam was framed as a crucial front in a global battle. If it fell to communism, officials warned, then neighboring countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, even Indonesia would be next. This was the domino theory, a phrase that became a political mantra. But beneath the surface of that tidy analogy lay deeper motives: fear of losing international credibility, fear of appearing weak, fear of letting the Soviet Union or China gain ground. Vietnam, a nation struggling to define its own future after nearly a century of colonial rule, became a symbol in someone else's narrative. Lyndon B. Johnson, like his predecessor John F. Kennedy, inherited this worldview. Johnson did not want to be remembered as the president who lost Vietnam, as Truman had been accused of losing China. In a world where perception was power, the U.S. could not afford even a symbolic retreat. The stakes, as they were described to the American people, were nothing short of global freedom itself. In this context, exaggerating Vietnam's strategic importance was not just political, it became existential. What is often left out of this narrative is how many within the administration knew this framing was misleading. Declassified documents and private memos reveal that top advisors questioned the domino theory. They doubted that Vietnam's fate would have the cascading effect being sold to the public. Some even admitted that Vietnam had little intrinsic value to U.S. national security. But instead of transparency, leaders leaned into fear. The American people were not given a chance to understand Vietnam on its own terms. They were presented with a moral emergency, a small nation, supposedly under siege by an expansionist ideology, bent on world domination. This oversimplification served a purpose. It made military action easier to justify. It helped silence dissent, and it created a false sense of clarity in a situation that was anything but. The Vietnam conflict was deeply rooted in anti-colonial nationalism, historical grievances, and regional politics that had little to do with Moscow or Beijing. Yet to admit this would have meant acknowledging that the U.S. was intervening not to stop a global threat, but to suppress a local struggle for independence. One that, ironically, echoed America's own founding ideals. The manipulation of Vietnam's image did not stop at geopolitics. It extended into propaganda, public statements, and media framing. Government briefings painted the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese as mere puppets of foreign powers, ignoring the strong nationalist motivations that drove them. They were cast as part of a faceless red tide, rather than as a people fighting for what they believed was liberation. Meanwhile, South Vietnam, despite its rampant corruption and questionable legitimacy, was described as a brave bastion of democracy. The result was a war built on illusions. American soldiers were sent to fight an enemy they did not fully understand. In a land that had been flattened into a Cold War caricature, every village was seen as a potential outpost of global communism. Every setback was interpreted as a blow to Western civilization itself. And as the war dragged on, with mounting casualties and no clear path to victory, the gap between the official story and the ground reality grew impossible to ignore. By the late 1960s, the American public began to see through the cracks. The Tet Offensive in 1968, though a military failure for the North Vietnamese, shattered the illusion of imminent U.S. victory. The narrative of steady progress no longer held. Protests surged. Journalists uncovered contradictions. Leaked documents, most notably the Pentagon Papers, confirmed what many had suspected: that successive administrations had misled the public about the war's origins, goals, and chances of success, and at the center of it all was a fundamental lie: the myth that losing Vietnam meant losing the world. In reality, when the U.S. finally withdrew and Saigon fell in 1975, the feared chain reaction never came. Countries in Southeast Asia did not topple one by one. The Cold War continued, but the collapse of the global order did not. Vietnam became, in many ways, a tragic exception rather than a harbinger. The war had been fought not for what Vietnam was, but for what it had been made to represent. This is the danger of exaggerating strategic value for political ends. When leaders conflate perception with reality, when they allow ideology to override facts, the consequences can be catastrophic. Wars are no longer about places and people. They become abstract battles in imaginary theaters, where the human cost is too often hidden behind the language of patriotism, freedom, and fear. In Vietnam, that cost was enormous. Millions of lives lost, entire generations scarred, and for America, a legacy of mistrust, division, and unanswered questions, all of it made possible because a faraway nation was turned into a symbol, its complexities flattened, its people sidelined, and its true place in history distorted by the needs of power. They called it a war for freedom, a noble stand against tyranny in a faraway land. But as the years dragged on, as body bags returned home by the thousands, as news footage painted a grimmer picture, with each passing day the American public began to ask, what are we really doing in Vietnam? That question, whispered in classrooms and shouted in protests, finally exploded with the release of a single, classified document that shattered the illusion: the Pentagon Papers. Leaked in 1971 by former military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers were not just internal memos. They were the government's own admissions compiled over years, outlining the decision-making that led the United States deeper and deeper into a war it knew it could not win. And among the most explosive revelations was this: as much as 70% of the rationale for continuing the war was not about stopping communism, or defending democracy, or protecting the South Vietnamese people. It was, in the words of the document itself, to avoid a humiliating defeat. That one phrase pulled the curtain back. For all the talk of dominoes falling, for all the speeches about liberty, the truth was something far more human and far more damning. It was pride, prestige, the fear of looking weak on the world stage, the fear of admitting that the most powerful nation in the world had misjudged, misstepped, and misunderstood a conflict it should never have entered in the first place. To understand how we got there, we have to rewind back to the early 1960s, when advisors first began trickling into Vietnam, back to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where murky radar reports were used to justify open warfare, back to the inflated reports of enemy casualties and shrinking U.S. victory timelines. Carefully crafted narratives meant not to reflect battlefield reality, but to preserve domestic political support. Every escalation, every bombing campaign, every draft call-up was part of a desperate attempt to sustain the image of strength, even as policymakers privately admitted they had no path to victory. What the Pentagon Papers confirmed was what many had long suspected: that the war effort was sustained not by strategy, but by fear. Fear that defeat in Vietnam would embolden adversaries. Fear that allies would question American resolve. Fear that voters would turn against presidents who blinked first. And so one administration after another, Democratic and Republican alike, kicked the can forward, sending more troops, approving more airstrikes, demanding more sacrifice, all to delay the moment of reckoning. This was not just a betrayal of military families or of the Vietnamese people. It was a betrayal of democracy itself, because the American public had been told one thing, that this was a war of necessity, and yet, behind closed doors, the conversation was entirely different. Officials spoke not of progress, but of quagmires, not of hope, but of hopelessness. And yet the war continued with no clear goal, no exit strategy, and no end in sight. The irony is painful. A war justified by the need to protect freedom abroad had, in effect, undermined transparency at home. When the truth finally came out, it confirmed the worst fears of the anti-war movement. That young Americans were dying, not for a cause, but for the appearance of credibility. That the U.S. government had chosen to preserve face over lives, and that even as opposition grew, even as trust in leadership eroded, those at the top continued to gamble with blood for the sake of optics. And yet, the release of the Pentagon Papers did more than expose the past. It forced a national reckoning. For the first time, Americans could see the cost of unchecked power, of unchallenged narratives, of decisions made in the dark. It became a defining moment in American political consciousness, a crack in the wall of Cold War certainty, and a warning for the future. The story of Vietnam is not just about military tactics or foreign policy. It is about what happens when governments forget who they serve, when public image becomes more important than public interest, when leaders refuse to tell the truth, not because they do not know it, but because they fear its consequences. As we reflect on that era, we are left with a simple but haunting question. How many lives were lost not to protect freedom, but to avoid embarrassment? If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that history should be examined with honesty, with nuance, and with courage, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and help us keep these conversations alive. Because understanding the past is the first step toward building a better future. They marched through rice paddies and jungles, under blistering heat and relentless gunfire, many still barely out of their teenage years. With rifles slung across their backs and uncertainty in their eyes, they were told they were defending democracy, protecting a small Southeast Asian nation from falling into the hands of a brutal ideology. They believed they were part of something noble, something righteous. But as the months turned into years, and the casualties mounted with no clear end in sight, an unspoken truth began to surface. A truth that would later be confirmed in the pages of the Pentagon Papers and in the weary eyes of returning veterans. These young Americans were not dying to spread freedom. They were dying to protect reputations, political careers, institutional pride, and the illusion of invincibility. From the beginning, U.S. involvement in Vietnam was framed as a fight against the spread of communism. The domino theory suggested that if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would soon follow, eventually threatening U.S. allies and global security. This narrative was powerful. It fit neatly into the Cold War mindset. It provided moral clarity to an otherwise complex civil conflict. But behind that rhetoric, internal memos and classified reports painted a different picture. One of hesitation, confusion, and above all, fear. Not fear of enemy tanks crossing into California, but of something far more abstract. Fear of national humiliation. Presidents, advisors, and military leaders knew the truth early on. The war was not going as planned. The enemy was resilient, the terrain brutal, the South Vietnamese government corrupt and unstable. But each administration, from Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon, chose to escalate rather than withdraw, not because victory was in sight, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Admitting defeat, pulling out, they feared, would signal weakness. It would embolden adversaries, shake Allied confidence, and expose them to political backlash at home. So the war dragged on, not as a military necessity, but as a political calculation. In the process, over 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives. Tens of thousands more returned home physically wounded, emotionally scarred, or mentally broken. The cost for Vietnamese civilians both in the North and South was exponentially higher. Yet despite the mounting toll, Washington clung to the narrative. Leaders stood before cameras and reassured the public that progress was being made, even as their private conversations revealed doubts, contradictions, and growing despair. The discrepancy between the public image and the private reality became one of the great moral crises of modern American history. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 blew the lid off this deception. Among the most startling revelations was the admission that a primary reason for continuing the war cited in internal documents was to avoid a humiliating defeat. Not to win, not to stabilize the region, not even to help the South Vietnamese, but simply to avoid embarrassment on the world stage. That kind of reasoning, hidden from the people, costs lives. It turns soldiers into symbols, battles into press conferences, and war into theater. And the actors, the ones who paid the real price, were often too young to vote for the leaders who sent them there. The human cost was incalculable. Families shattered, communities hollowed. A generation of Americans grew up with images of helicopters lifting off from embassies, of burning villages, of coffins draped in flags. And still, the political machinery moved on. Officials who had championed the war quietly distanced themselves. Others shifted blame or insisted it had been worth it, even as the nation struggled to make sense of what had been lost and why. But the deeper tragedy lies in what could have been. The United States possessed unmatched military might, economic power, and global influence. It could have chosen diplomacy, development, or strategic containment. Instead, pride steered policy. Fear of being seen as weak led to decisions that proved catastrophic, not only for Vietnam, but for America's moral authority and the trust of its people. Those who returned home from the war often faced a country divided. Some were met with silence, others with scorn. The nation itself was fractured between those who had supported the war and those who had opposed it, between those who believed the official line and those who had always questioned it. Healing took decades. In many ways, it is still ongoing. And yet, from this darkness emerged a vital lesson, a warning echoed across generations. Never let ego dictate policy. Never allow fear of looking weak to override the responsibility to do what is right. And never forget that the true cost of war is measured not in maps or political speeches, but in human lives. Every decision made behind closed doors has consequences that ripple outward into families, communities, and history itself. So when we remember the Vietnam War, we must remember the soldiers not just as heroes, but as victims of a system that prioritized image over integrity. Their bravery remains unquestioned. Their sacrifice profound. But the tragedy is that many died not for democracy, but because powerful men feared the headlines more than the funerals. If you believe stories like these matter, if you think history should be told honestly, with care and context, then consider subscribing, sharing your thoughts, and helping this platform continue its mission to tell the truth, even when it is difficult. Because only by facing the past can we hope to build a better future. They came not just with boots on the ground, but with the thunder of engines in the sky. From high above the clouds, American B-52 bombers flew in formation, their bellies filled with payloads of destruction. The earth trembled beneath them as bombs fell in waves, saturating the jungles, fields, rivers, and towns of Vietnam in a storm of fire and steel. It was called Operation Rolling Thunder, a name meant to inspire fear to show resolve. And yet, beneath the noise, beneath the smoke, a quiet truth lay buried under the rubble. No matter how many tons of explosives were dropped, the war refused to bend to America's will. Between 1965 and 1973, the United States unleashed over 7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, more than all the bombs dropped by all sides in World War II combined. These were not just targeted military strikes. Entire villages were leveled. Forests were set ablaze. Farmland was cratered beyond recognition. Roads, bridges, and irrigation systems, vital to daily survival, were turned into twisted wreckage. The strategy was simple in theory. Break the enemy's capacity and will to fight by overwhelming them with superior firepower. But the reality on the ground was far more complex and far more tragic. The people of Vietnam, farmers, children, grandparents, were caught in the middle. They were not merely collateral damage. They were often the primary victims. In the countryside, where support for either side could change depending on survival, families watched their homes vanish in seconds. They dug shelters beneath the soil, hid in caves and tunnels, clung to each other during endless nights of bombardment, praying that the next blast would not be their last. The psychological toll was immense. For many, the sky itself became a source of terror. In areas like Quang Tri, Ha Tin, and the infamous Iron Triangle, the land still bears the scars. Decades later, children are still injured or killed by unexploded ordnance left behind, silent reminders of a war that ended long ago but refuses to be forgotten. The soil, once fertile, was poisoned by chemicals like Agent Orange, a defoliant used to strip away jungle cover. In doing so, it also poisoned water sources, destroyed crops, and triggered a public health crisis that continues to echo across generations. Children were born with deformities. Adults suffered from cancers and other chronic illnesses. Entire communities became trapped in cycles of suffering, all for the sake of a war that brought no lasting peace. And still, the campaign did not achieve its goals. The bombing failed to break the morale of the North Vietnamese forces. It did not drive a wedge between them and the southern population. It did not force the enemy to the negotiating table. Instead, it often hardened their resolve. As one North Vietnamese official would later recount, the more bombs they dropped, the more determined we became. In the rural villages and dense forests, the Vietnamese people adapted. They rebuilt shelters, developed elaborate tunnel systems, and moved supplies under the cover of night. The terrain itself, resilient, complex, and unfamiliar to foreign forces, became an ally to those who knew it best. Meanwhile, back in the United States, support for the war continued to erode. Images of bombed-out villages and wounded civilians began appearing in newspapers and on television screens. The gap between what the government said and what the public saw became harder to ignore. A new generation of Americans began to question the ethics of the war, not just because of the cost in lives, but because of what it was doing to a land and a people thousands of miles away. It became harder to justify the destruction when there was so little to show for it. And what of stability? That elusive goal, repeated in speech after speech, never materialized. South Vietnam, even with American support, remained politically fragile and deeply divided. Corruption plagued its leadership. Its military, though better equipped, often lacked morale and direction. In the final years of the war, as American troops withdrew and the bombing campaigns tapered off, the cracks widened. Without the constant flow of external support, the South could not hold. Saigon fell in 1975, just 2 years after the last American bombs were dropped. The irony is that the very tools meant to ensure stability, the bombs, the chemicals, the overwhelming show of force, only deepened the instability. They destroyed the environment that people relied on for food and water. They displaced millions, creating refugee crises across the region. And they alienated much of the local population, who no longer saw America as a liberator, but as a force of destruction. In trying to win the war from the air, the U.S. overlooked the ground reality that wars are not won by destroying land, but by winning hearts and minds. And that is precisely where the campaign failed. Today, visitors to Vietnam can still walk through forests that never fully grew back, stand beside lakes formed from bomb craters, and meet families living in the shadow of a war they never asked for. The land heals slowly, and so do the people. But memory remains a quiet, persistent echo of decisions made in distant rooms by people who never walked the fields they destroyed. And yet, from that devastation comes an opportunity for reflection, a chance to ask, what was truly gained and at what cost? When we study history, we are not just learning about the past, we are learning about ourselves, about the values we uphold, and the consequences of abandoning them. The bombing of Vietnam stands as a testament to the danger of mistaking might for wisdom and of confusing destruction with victory. If you value stories that speak honestly, that honor both the victims and the lessons, then stay with us. Share your thoughts, subscribe for more, and help keep history alive, not as a weapon, but as a warning. Because the past is not just something we remember, it is something we must learn from. While the Vietnam War raged half a world away, another conflict was unfolding quietly on American soil. A war of class, race, and privilege hidden beneath the draft notices and patriotic speeches. The military conscription system, intended to spread the burden of national defense across the population, instead became a mirror reflecting the inequities of American society Beneath the rhetoric of duty and sacrifice lay a brutal truth. Those who fought and died disproportionately came from America's poorest neighborhoods and most marginalized communities. In theory, the selective service system was supposed to be blind, nonpartisan, apolitical, and fair. In practice, it functioned like a sieve, filtering out the children of the wealthy and powerful while sweeping up young men from working-class families, African American communities, and rural towns. College deferments became the most effective shield for the affluent. A young man enrolled in university could delay and often avoid military service altogether. For the well-connected, that delay frequently became permanent. Many found comfortable havens in graduate school, law programs, or even medical residencies far from the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, others had no such luxury. In cities like Detroit, Birmingham, and the Bronx, and across the Deep South and Midwest, draft notices arrived like death warrants. For many young men of color, there was no university to protect them, no sympathetic draft board to grant deferments, no family connections to pull strings behind the scenes. Their fate was sealed not by their patriotism or lack thereof, but by the zip code they were born into and the color of their skin. This inequity was not subtle. It was statistical fact. African Americans, who made up roughly 11% of the U.S. population at the time, accounted for over 20% of combat deaths in the early years of the war. That imbalance was not just a matter of chance. It reflected a system that assigned value to lives unevenly, rewarding privilege with safety and punishing poverty with sacrifice. Poor white Americans also found themselves in the same vice. Boys who had dropped out of school, who worked factory jobs, who had never left their hometowns, suddenly found themselves thousands of miles from home, navigating jungles and firefights, often for a cause they could not fully articulate. The system bred resentment and confusion. How could a war being sold as a noble defense of democracy demand its highest price from those with the least democratic access to power in their own country? How could the sons of senators, governors, and corporate executives conveniently find National Guard posts, medical exemptions, or educational deferrals, while kids from the inner city or Appalachia were marched into basic training? The injustice did not go unnoticed. As opposition to the war grew, many began to question not just the war's purpose, but its human cost. Activists, students, veterans, and civil rights leaders pointed to the racial and class disparities in conscription as proof that the war was less about freedom abroad and more about preserving hierarchies at home. Martin Luther King Jr., in his historic 1967 speech Beyond Vietnam, condemned the war as a betrayal of American values. He spoke of a cruel manipulation of the poor, a system in which young black men were sent to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia or East Harlem. By the late 1960s, the anger was boiling over. Draft card burnings became symbolic acts of defiance. Protests erupted on college campuses and city streets, not only decrying the war, but the selective way it was being fought. It was not just about Vietnam anymore. It was about America's soul, about whose lives were valued, and whose could be discarded in the name of geopolitical chess games. Some young men, unwilling to fight in what they saw as an unjust war, fled to Canada or went underground. Others submitted to prison sentences rather than participate. Still others, despite their misgivings, reported for duty, clinging to hope or to honor or to survival. But the damage was done. A generation was fractured by politics, by race, by privilege, and by the brutal arithmetic of the draft. And when those soldiers returned, if they returned, they often came home to a nation divided. For the poor and the marginalized, there were no parades, no private clinics, no safety nets. There were only memories of trauma, of fallen comrades, and of a system that had used them as pawns. Many struggled with unemployment, addiction, or psychological scars that never healed. The same society that had sent them to war had little use for them once they came back. In retrospect, the draft became one of the war's most damning indictments. It exposed the hypocrisy of a government that spoke of unity while practicing exclusion, that demanded sacrifice from the voiceless while shielding the influential. It revealed the uncomfortable truth that American democracy, when tested under fire, had faltered in ensuring equality, not just at the ballot box, but on the battlefield. The Vietnam War did not just end with the fall of Saigon. Its legacy lived on, in the veterans left behind, in the communities that mourned their sons, and in the deep fissures it exposed in American society. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is that a nation cannot claim to fight for freedom abroad while denying justice at home. There was no single moment when the United States sat down, reviewed its goals, and clearly outlined what victory in Vietnam would look like. From the very beginning, the path was shrouded in ambiguity. There was no national debate on how success would be defined, what cost was acceptable, or whether the mission itself was viable. Instead, the U.S. slid deeper into the quagmire one step at a time, first with advisors, then with weapons, then with troops, then with bombs driven by fear, inertia, and pride, more than purpose. The cultural misalignment was staggering. Vietnam was not a chessboard for Cold War games. It was a nation with millennia of resistance against foreign domination. The Vietnamese people did not see themselves as pawns in a global ideological struggle. They saw themselves as fighting for independence, just as Americans once did against the British Empire. But that perspective was barely acknowledged in the U.S. policy framework. Instead, American leaders relied on oversimplified narratives, labeling the conflict as a straightforward battle between freedom and communism. In doing so, they missed the deeper truths of Vietnamese history, society, and aspiration. At the core of the American miscalculation was the belief that military might could override cultural complexity. Washington assumed that bombs, body counts, and superior technology would force Hanoi to its knees. But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army were not just fighting for a political ideology, they were fighting for their homeland. No amount of firepower could erase that resolve. Villages that had existed for generations were reduced to rubble in bombing raids. Crops were destroyed, forests scorched, and children left orphaned. But instead of breaking the will of the Vietnamese people, these actions often strengthened it. Even the American soldiers on the ground felt the confusion. Many of them arrived in Vietnam without any real sense of the country's history or the war's purpose. They were trained to fight, but not taught why. They were sent to rural hamlets where they could not speak the language, where friend and enemy were indistinguishable, and where the line between survival and atrocity blurred quickly. When the mission lacks clarity, morality becomes a moving target. Back in Washington, the story was no clearer. Policy shifted with every administration, every cabinet reshuffle, every political calculation. Military leaders gave optimistic forecasts that masked deteriorating realities. Political leaders, fearful of being labeled soft on communism, escalated in increments, hoping each step would be the last. But none of it was tethered to a coherent strategy. There was no timetable, no definition of success that could withstand scrutiny. Instead, there was just the hope that somehow, if enough pressure was applied, the problem would resolve itself. The contradiction was painful. America prided itself on being a beacon of liberty, a defender of self-determination, and yet it found itself propping up a regime in South Vietnam that lacked democratic legitimacy, that jailed dissidents, and that ruled through coercion rather than consent. The war became a contradiction not only in policy but in values. Young Americans were told they were fighting for freedom, but what they often encountered was corruption, repression, and the grim calculus of survival. And the exit, there, was not one. As early as 1965, some analysts in the Pentagon warned that the war was unwinnable, yet their warnings were buried. Why? Because leaving would mean admitting defeat, and the Cold War was not a climate in which such admissions came easily. Leaders feared the domino effect, that if Vietnam fell, so too would Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and beyond. This fear became a self-reinforcing loop. Every setback in Vietnam was used to justify more commitment, more troops, more bombing, because to stop would be to risk losing face on the world stage. By the late 1960s, public opinion at home began to shift. The American people, watching the war unfold on television every night, began to ask questions. What are we doing there? Why are our sons dying? How long will this last? The answers were unsatisfying. The government's messaging grew more desperate. Each announcement of progress was contradicted by footage of carnage. Each promise of peace was followed by new escalations. The trust between the government and the governed began to fracture. Vietnam exposed not only strategic errors, but the dangers of a foreign policy untethered from historical understanding and cultural humility. It revealed what happens when a nation engages in war, not because it must, but because it does not know how to back down. And it left a scar not only on Vietnam, whose landscape and people bore the physical toll, but on America itself, whose faith in its institutions and ideals would never be quite the same. As we reflect on that chapter today, we are reminded that military power, however vast, cannot substitute for clarity of purpose. That winning hearts and minds requires more than weapons. That history, if ignored, will not absolve, only repeat. In the early years of the Vietnam War, the story that reached American living rooms was not the one unfolding in the jungles and rice paddies halfway across the world. Instead, it was a curated tale, clean, composed, and often far removed from the raw truths experienced by soldiers on the ground. Television anchors spoke of progress, officials cited body counts as metrics of success, and press briefings at the Pentagon painted a picture of a war that was being won. Behind closed doors, however, that narrative was cracking. Intelligence reports were often filtered, rewritten, or simply ignored if they did not align with Washington's preferred outlook. Warnings from field commanders about the resilience of the Viet Cong or the weakness of the South Vietnamese government were downplayed. Numbers were manipulated, sometimes unintentionally through the chaos of war, but often intentionally to support the illusion of control. Success, in the official narrative, was always just around the corner. Even as the enemy grew stronger, the terrain more hostile, and American morale more fragile, the media, at least in the early stages, played along, not out of conspiracy, but out of tradition. For decades, during conflicts like World War II and Korea, journalists had worked in cooperation with the military. There was a sense of national unity, a belief that the government and press shared the same goals. But Vietnam was different. Reporters were granted access to the front lines, yet their dispatches were often reshaped by editors back home who leaned on official government sources for verification. Stories that contradicted the Pentagon's message were often buried or softened, and graphic images, those that showed wounded children, scorched villages, or American soldiers disillusioned and afraid, were deemed too sensitive for public consumption. But as the war dragged on, the truth became harder to hide. Soldiers returned home with stories that did not match the headlines. Families received letters filled with confusion, bitterness, and despair. Independent reporters, frustrated by the gaps between what they saw and what was reported, began to push back. The illusion of victory began to fray. One turning point came with the release of images from the Tet Offensive in 1968. Though it was technically a military setback for North Vietnam, it shattered the myth that the enemy was on the brink of collapse. Scenes of chaos in Saigon, the American embassy under siege, and the stark look of fear on the faces of U.S. troops were beamed into American homes. The gap between official optimism and brutal reality had grown too wide to ignore. Soon after, the credibility of government statements eroded further. Revelations surfaced that the Gulf of Tonkin incident used as justification for escalating U.S. involvement had been exaggerated. Leaked documents later confirmed that officials knew the war was unwinnable years before they admitted it publicly. The Pentagon Papers, published in 1971, revealed a pattern of deception that spanned 4 administrations, each choosing to escalate or prolong the war rather than risk political fallout by telling the truth. For many Americans, this was a betrayal not just of trust, but of values. The country that prided itself on transparency, democracy, and freedom of the press was now seen by many of its citizens as a machine of propaganda. College campuses erupted in protest. Students burned draft cards and chanted against the war. Mothers marched with pictures of their sons, demanding answers. Veterans returned, not to parades, but to suspicion and silence, often joining the growing movement of dissent themselves. The protests were not just about the war. They were about the deeper realization that their government had deliberately misled them. The frustration was not only with policy, but with the process, with the way facts had been twisted, voices silenced, and warnings ignored. Young people questioned not just the war, but the institutions that allowed it to continue. And for the first time in modern history, Americans began to see their own government as fallible not just in error but in motive. Despite this growing resistance, official messaging remained stubbornly upbeat. Leaders framed the protests as unpatriotic, even dangerous. They warned of subversion, painted dissent as weakness, and clung to the narrative that peace was only possible through strength. But outside the corridors of power, the tide had already turned. With every passing month, more Americans began to ask, if we can't trust what we are being told, how can we believe in what we are being asked to fight for? This crisis of confidence did not just affect Vietnam policy, it reshaped American society. Journalism became more aggressive. Citizens became more skeptical. Institutions that once inspired, reverence now invited scrutiny. The age of passive consumption was over. A new era of questioning had begun, and though the war would continue for years after the first major protests, its moral foundation had already collapsed. In time, the voices once dismissed as radical would prove prescient. The sanitized story of Vietnam gave way to a far more complicated, painful, and necessary truth, one that exposed not only the costs of war abroad, but the consequences of deception at home. And from that reckoning, the American public would learn an enduring lesson, that silence in the face of falsehood is not patriotism, and that the freedom to question may be the most powerful weapon a democracy possesses. Ironically, as the dust settled decades later, the answer to one of America's most painful chapters came not through battle cries or political declarations, but through trade agreements, diplomatic handshakes, and business summits. Vietnam, the very nation once portrayed as the front line in the fight against global communism, now stands as a growing economic partner of the United States. American corporations invest billions into Vietnamese manufacturing. Vietnamese officials host U.S. diplomats with warmth and vision for mutual prosperity. Starbucks and Apple stores dot the streets where tanks once rolled, and tourists stroll through Hanoi and Saigon with cameras instead of rifles. The question echoes louder than ever. What truly was the war for? This closing irony is not lost on the veterans who returned home to parades of silence, and the shattered families who still set a place at the table for someone who never made it back. It is not lost on the Vietnamese who rebuilt their lives from ashes and shrapnel, or on the American citizens who learned too late that truth was often a casualty of war. In retrospect, so many of the justifications seem hollow. Domino theories, Red Scares, moral crusades. These now feel like shadows cast by people who never had to march through jungle rains or explain a flag-draped coffin to a 6-year-old child. The United States went to war without understanding the Vietnamese people, their history, or their struggles. It attempted to reshape a complex civil conflict through foreign policy lenses crafted in Washington, far removed from the rice paddies and mountains of Southeast Asia. Leaders clung to flawed logic and disproven assumptions, perpetuating a war long after public support collapsed. They feared losing face more than they feared losing lives. For the Vietnamese, it was always about sovereignty and identity. For the Americans, it became about pride, perception, and politics. The deeper tragedy is not just the staggering loss of life, but how many of those lives were gambled for reasons no longer even discussed in history classrooms. Today, students may read about the Tet Offensive or the Paris Peace Accords, but few textbooks capture the quiet disillusionment of a nation that saw its ideals compromised and its confidence shaken. Even fewer address the fact that, in the long run, Vietnam's trajectory did not validate the war's purpose, but quietly invalidated it. And still, here we are. The flags of both nations fly side by side at embassies. Vietnamese students study abroad in American universities. Veterans from both sides meet in shared remembrance, some even helping to clear unexploded bombs still buried in the soil. The bitterness has dulled, not erased, but dulled, replaced by a pragmatic cooperation that reflects a truth no general ever acknowledged. Sometimes, history unfolds not with triumph, but with uneasy reconciliation. This leaves us with an open-ended question. What was it really all for? If the enemy of yesterday becomes today's business partner, if the so-called global domino never tipped, if freedom was never the central motivation, then was the war ever truly necessary? Or was it the result of 1,000 small misjudgments, compounded by fear, politics, and hubris? These are not easy questions. They are not meant to be. But they matter because only by understanding the mistakes of the past can we hope to avoid repeating them. Only by confronting uncomfortable truths can we honor those who paid the ultimate price with more than empty slogans. And only by remembering that lives were lost not for what was real, but for what was imagined can we shape a better future, where foreign policy begins not with fear, but with knowledge, respect, and humility. Thank you for staying with us on this journey through one of the most complex and consequential chapters in modern history. If this story gave you new insight, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who might find it meaningful. Your support helps us continue to create thoughtful, well-researched stories that bring history to life in ways that matter. Until next time, take care of each other, keep asking the hard questions, and, as always, sleep well.